Hello, today we are with Pablo Pelegrin, professor of the University of Murcia. And would you like to introduce yourself, Pablo?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for this interview. I'm Pablo Pelegrin. I'm full professor of immunology at the University of Murcia. This is in the southeast of Spain. And I have a research group that we are mainly focused on inflammation.
May I ask you, how did you fall in love with research? What happened at a certain point in your life?
Well, I think this is since I was very little. I was very interested in how things work. So I was interested in how everything works, so handles in the doors or whatever. So I was always dissecting things in my house. So I think I have an innate property to know how things, and especially the body works, especially in pathology, and I was interested in biology, biochemistry, and cell biology.
So it was your curiosity that made you become a scientist?
Yes. I may be as a physicist, a chemist, but at the end I was a biologist and in the medical field. But my curiosity on how things are working and how the human body works, I think is a real challenge and very interesting.
Okay, and you are an expert of inflammation. I would like to ask you how chronic inflammation works, because we know that chronic inflammation is involved in several pathologies. May you explain us quickly?
Yes, and this is a very relevant question because chronic inflammation is beyond most of the chronic pathology nowadays. So inflammation is a good response. It's important for fighting against pathogens, but when this response is dysregulated and cannot stop, it originates a chronic response. And this chronic response is this chronic inflammation that will damage tissues and organs in the body and will cause pathology. So basically that happens when the signals that trigger inflammation is still there in recurrent in the body. So they cannot stop, and it's like a positive feedback loop. So every time it's more and more and more and more. So sometimes when chronic inflammation is clinically relevant, has already damaged and has been already developing for several years, and maybe in some cases subclinically, so we don't know that we are starting having this chronic inflammatory process.
Okay, so inflammation is a positive process when it helps us fighting diseases, but when it's sustained, when it continues over time for long periods, it can be harmful.
Yes.
And can you make me some examples of some pathologies in which chronic inflammation is crucial?
Yes, for example, everybody will know chronic inflammation in the joints that causes gout or arthritis. But nowadays we know that, for example, in the brain, inflammation is triggering Alzheimer, and most of scientists nowadays will affirm that Alzheimer is an inflammatory disease. Or in diabetes, type 2 diabetes is also a chronic inflammatory process. So it depends on the organ that will target chronic inflammation, you will have different diseases.
Okay, and how purinergic receptors are involved in this process?
Yes, this is more a technical question, of course, but they are very relevant because purinergic receptors trigger many inflammatory reactions in the body. And when the ligands for these receptors are over the time, or they are produced without regulation, that will lead to the activation and lead with the time to this chronicity of the inflammatory response.
Okay, and just one last question. Do you know some therapies to treat these chronic inflammation situations that rely on purinergic receptors?
Yes, there are a lot of development both in basic research and also in clinical research and pharmaceutical research. And many efforts are paid into developing novel compounds. Now we know that there are few compounds that are getting into clinical trials after being analyzed in basic research, targeting purinergic receptors, and that may be applied to mainly chronic inflammatory in the brain. So most of the efforts are coming into the brain because, as I said before, chronic inflammation in the brain is causing damage and degenerative diseases.
Okay, so there is a likelihood to develop new therapies that block chronic inflammation in brain, and so we can use these therapies to treat diseases like Alzheimer or Parkinson, right?
Yes, that's exactly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pablo.
Thank you.